The last time that I was here, we actually ended on a note, on a specific paradigm for ancient Indian history. And today when we begin to talk about the Indic concept of history, we'll actually start where we ended last time. So those of us who were there might get that connection. It's a particular way of actually understanding history and civilization through analogy. But once we set that as our introductory frame, we will actually refer to it and use it as we go through this journey of understanding the Indic view of history and itihas, etc. And that paradigm is a very simple one. It uses analogy to actually understand civilization and history in a new lens. So the first leg of that is that as consciousness is to the individual, civilization is to the collective. Now what this means is that depending on our point of view, we understand consciousness as something that either emerges from brain matter when information is processed in very complex ways, or it is something that descends into brain matter because consciousness is fundamental. But either way, whatever is consciousness to the individual, which means that it is a felt experience, it is first person, it is subjective, that is what civilization is to a collective. It is first person, it is together felt, and it is entirely subjective. And taking this analogy further, as memory is to consciousness, history is to civilization. So when we want to understand our own lives, when we want to get our own sense of identity, our memory and our unbroken stream of memory is very essential. That is what actually a history is to a people. It is their own sense of self, their own story of how they have come about, how they have been all this while. And the analogy holds. So if I want to subvert your sense of self, one of the ways I can do this is actually play with your sense of memory. I can tell you for things that you believe that no, this never happened, you are imagining things. I can tell you for things that happened that why are you forgetting, you're becoming so forgetful, don't you remember this happened. And if I do this long enough, egregiously enough, I will actually cause you to doubt yourself. This is exactly what can be done with history. You can tell a civilization that what it remembers about itself is false, it never happened. These are later interpolations, etc. Or you can tell a civilization what it does not even know or think that that is the truth, that don't you remember half of you came from outside, you are descended from blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. And when you do this long enough, you can subvert a civilization's sense of self. You can cause it to doubt itself. And this is in fact what has been the story of India's colonization, at least as the India's colonization of India's history and how India relates to its own past. And further, what is the use of all of this history? What is the use of all of this memory? So just like all of us, we use our memory to inform ourselves. So our memory is actually the observer, our consciousness is both the observer and subject of our memory. We use our memory not only to inform ourselves, but actually to assess ourselves, to tell ourselves what to do in the future. So it becomes a learning mechanism. And as we have all learnt in school as well, that history is important for the lessons it can teach us. So similarly, history is both the observer and subject of civilization. This is the overarching analogy that we should keep in mind as we try to get into the Indic view of history. And when we do this now, we should begin with the works of Professor Bal Gangadhar, who has a very beautiful essay here that I recommend everyone read. In that essay, it's titled this, and he asks, what do Indians need? Do Indians need a history or a past? So obviously by implication, he's trying to draw some kind of contrast here between history and the past. What is that contrast? So he talks about how we should be asking ourselves that what does history mean? How should we as free people think about history and all of its meanings, its implications? And he says, he critiques it, that the documentary paradigm of history, which is historiography that emphasizes evidence, document, inscription, fossils, etc., that as the sources of truth, that has become the pervading sense and definition of history today. So there are some latent assumptions in this. The assumption being that if I just collect enough evidence, if I just study enough rocks, enough texts, enough coins, enough inscriptions, I can actually figure out some kind of true story of the past. That is the base assumption that modern history is based on. But where does that assumption come from? And we're diving into this head on because it's very important to actually understand before we even begin to get into the Indian view of history. We have to understand the current view of history, its precedents, and where has it come from. And inevitably, the current view of history has actually come from the Judeo-Christian paradigm. Why? Because prior to the rise of Judeo-Christianity, and even today in different parts of the world, all human beings, all people, they have their own stories of the past. This is not remarkable. All people, in fact, share legends, share stories, mythologies around the campfire when grandparents tell their children different stories and lore. This is how people pass on stories of the past. Dr. Professor Nicholas Kazanas, who is now a Padma Shri awardee, he even says that whether it is 600 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, it's not remarkable that people would have legends, people would have great people who do great deeds, who lead great times, and that these stories would pass into legend, into mythology, such that they are shared over and over again over generations. Which is to say that a people do not need writing, documentation, historiography to have their own sense of the past. They can have it even without all of this. But this particular paradigm that we should have this is a paradigm that actually began with the advent of Judeo-Christianity, prior to which all people had their own stories of the past. What happened when Christianity came into being was that now we needed to find one story of mankind, because it was no longer enough to let all people have their own stories of the past. What we needed was all people to agree that yes, there is this God figure. That God figure has let you live in sin for these many thousands of years, until his own son has not come to salvage you from these sins. Your history is irrelevant. And it had to be established amongst all of us. So the very basis for Christianity to actually expand, it needed us to negate our own stories of the past and come into one shared story of humanity. And that is the lens that actually began the historical precedent. And therefore, it became necessary for the God of Israel to actually become the God of all of humanity. Now, when we critique this, we are not saying this to actually critique history as a discipline itself. As we will come to see, there are many ways to understand, incorporate history and reconcile it with a people's sense of past. But as we talk about anything, the Indic view of anything, we have to at least become conscious of and realize the current lenses and paradigms that have led us where we are. Because why is it that we have in fact even a very paradigm to find out the truth for something, or the truth of the past? That paradigm comes from somewhere. And Professor Bal Gangadhar, I quote him here, in reality, when people have many stories of their past, why do they have these stories of the past? Those stories are actually meant to help in living well and flourishing in the present. And in most groups that have evolved into cultures, some kind of implicit consensus is present regarding what human flourishing is. That is what it means to live a good life. And in his own words, in this sense, each human group has some kind of story about the past. So we must ask ourselves that whatever we call this discipline of history and whatever its objectives, are they actually in line with what is most obviously the clearest reason for human beings to share stories, which is the human flourishing, happiness and prosperity. And if the historical enterprise, if the historical discipline takes us away from this objective, then we must ask ourselves of what good is it really. So once again, this is not to say that let us not conduct the historical enterprise, but this is to say that this sets the true barometer, the true standard for what a historical enterprise should really achieve. And when we go deeper into this, then we find out that once you have established that there has to be some true study of the past, there is in fact one true story of the past. The moment you say that, you then have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we study the past such that we may find out the true stories only? So if there are many stories of the past and you have to find out only one true story, you obviously have to give to people ways to start negating their own histories of the past, because some of them are obviously false and only one true story has to exist. And therefore, the historical enterprise that exists today has become an enterprise that ruptures a people from their own sense of the past and their own sense of history. That is what modern history, modern historiography actually does, because it requires us to quote unquote find truth, and there are claims that have to be true claims. But counter to this, actually, Professor Bal Gangadhar also asks that why is it so necessary? Why do we have to find out if stories of the past are true? And think of the alternative. What if it turns out that they are false? In fact, whether they are true or false, how does that impact their original objective, which is human flourishing? And do people and as people have had their own histories and their own pasts, have they really concerned themselves with the material truths of those stories? Or has the morals of those stories, have the flourishing, the prosperity, the learning, the wisdom of those stories mattered? So should the true historical enterprise actually focus on finding that one truth claim? Or should it focus on helping people perpetuate, share those stories which best help them in their own condition, which best help them connect to their own traditions, their own ancestors, and their own civilizational trajectories that will lead them into the future? So this is a primary lens and a primary critique that we have to understand about the modern historical enterprise. And Professor Bal Gangadhar then gives an example. So he asks us to wonder and think about, what is the history of the epics achieved? So when we look at the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, let us say we have done the historical enterprise. तो क्या निकलता क्या उसका तात्पर्य क्या आता है? Well, okay, we have found out that okay, the Mahabharata war could have happened at some point in time, maybe a few thousand years ago. यहीं पे फिर संघर्ष और लड़ाई का आरंभ हो जाता है. Some people say 5,000 years, some people say 8,000 years, some people will say astronomical data, some people will say archaeological data, and a kind of conflict has begun, where already we have lost the first and original site of the epic. Number two, okay, when we do this, so we know it must have been in northern India, few thousand years ago, many tribes of India would have participated. But then at some stage, what it turns out is that we reduce these epics to mere historiographies, and we start to have to reconcile it by, yes, these are exaggerations, bhai usme Pushpak Viman was there or not, was Brahmastra there or not, can monkeys build bridges or not, can people live for thousands of years or not? And what is this doing? It is creating conflict within the collective psyche. A psyche that for thousands of years has been able to live with these tales and live in great comfort and celebration of these tales. A psyche that has actually transcended these tales to other geographies as well, such that the kings of Thailand today still add Ram at the end of their name. Does it matter for us to determine the day Sri Ram was born, the day Sri Ram killed Ravan, the day Sri Ram returned to Ayodhya, the day Sri Ram was crowned king, for these stories to be relevant culturally, socially, such that even today the kings of Thailand consider themselves descendants of Sri Ram? So this is the question that Professor Bal Gangadhar is asking, that what value are you really deriving and what value are you really giving to these epics, even through the historical enterprise? And he says that to grow up as an Indian is to learn that these stories should obviously be treated differently from our general lessons on geography and materiality. In fact, our lived experience as we have absorbed these stories and received these stories from our own ancestors, our grandparents, has been that whether or not some story really took place on earth or not, that's absolutely irrelevant to the truth of these stories, in fact. And there is a great anecdote about a Christian Jesuit who visited a monk in Bali, a Hindu priest in Bali, and they talk about the story of Ramayana. And the Jesuit tries to ask him, he says, did the Ramayana really happen? He says, yes, it really happened. Well, where did it happen? He says, okay, it happened in Ayodhya. So are you saying that in the modern city of Ayodhya, these many thousands of years ago, there was really a man? And the guy starts to say, well, that doesn't matter to me. The truth of the story is already true to me, even without its material historia being established or not. And in fact, the enterprise of trying to establish the material historia is creating schisms and conflicts that I don't need when engaging with these stories. So that is the primary critique that Professor Bal Gangadhar gives. And then he also warns us about the danger of good intentions. So in fact, this is a caveat, this is a warning to people such as me. Because my own journey has been, I have thought that actually in studying history in this way, I'll find some ways to still respect and affirm Indian civilizational memory. So I think that even with my good intentions, maybe I can engage in the historical enterprise. But Professor Bal Gangadhar warns us that there are some dangers also of good intentions. What are those dangers? So he gives a question. What happens when we make a claim that Ram Setu exists? वो bridge मिल गया, we see it on the satellite records as well, and we establish that yes, see, in the Ramayana it was written that they have thrown stones, they have built this bridge, here is the bridge, a real historical testimony has been given. What does this achieve? Well, first of all, yes, it brings happiness and euphoria. That is indeed the first step. We feel very nice, कि देखो, this has proved our stories, now they are validated. There is an initial wave of happiness and euphoria. But what's the second step? Now in the second step, we start to reach badly written historiographies. That, acha, what does it mean to say that Ram and Lakshman received Bal and Atibal? What are these things? Super strength can a human being receive? How can Sri Ram and Lakshman, these two people, fight whole armies of asuras in the forest? The asuras that they take on, the early cousins or brothers-in-law of Ravan. So now you start to reach these unnecessary reconciliations that you have to make in the text. And what does that do? It actually tells you what we already know as general thinking human beings. That of course monkeys that swing on the tree, they cannot build bridges. But by this time, how much have you degraded the story? Even though you started with those great intentions. And we don't even realize the last step of it. Because ye sab to ho bhi jaye, it's after this that the that the progressive intellectuals turn up. And they start finding, patriarchy, oppression, caste hierarchies, tribal dynamics, North India versus South India. So even with the best of intentions, I may have given that early happiness and euphoria. But what I have done is opened up the past of a people to torture and dissection by those who truly do not care about it. Those who are serving some higher ideal of what history should be as a discipline. But that was never the ideal. The ideal was what stories help us flourish, what stories help us contextualize our own place in this universe, our own identity as a people. So even with good intentions, good history can actually lead us astray. And even if I personally don't lead you astray with my good intentions, I will leave open attack vectors that tomorrow someone else can come and talk to them about and make us start to feel ashamed of our own epics, our own great people, our own great stories, our own great legends. Right? So those are the dangers of good intentions. Now having understood this, what Professor Balgangadhar then says, that what does history do? It severs a people's relationship with time. That's what it truly does. Whereas what a past does, a past helps them retain and contextualize it. So in fact, when he's talking about the past, what he's been meaning all along is itihas. So of course there is an etymological linguistic meaning of itihas, itihasa, this is how it happened. But beyond that, what itihas has been the Indian way to help retain and contextualize the transmission of their own learnings, their own wisdom. And this is expressed best by Professor Vishwa Adluri, which I often repeat this quote. He says, itihas represents the empirical world aesthetically. Very important words here. Pankaj just talked about the Hindu sense of art and aesthetic. Itihas is a way to represent the empirical world aesthetically. Number one, there is beauty, meaning and wisdom in it. Number two, it does this to problematize something. Problematize what? The condition we are in. We are both in the world. We have a relationship with the world, which is the relationship of ontology. We have a relationship with the texts that we write to tell our own history. And there is an outer world. These are all different components that come together when people make myths, share stories, transmit information. And that is what itihas really addresses and problematizes. And therefore, he rightly says, itihas is history that has overcome historicism. It is history that has become critical and self-conscious. So that is the metaphor we started with, that as memory is to consciousness, history is to a civilization. And because memory is a tool of self-reflection, it is a tool of self-identity, learning and growth. That is what itihas truly is. If anything else, it is not actually itihas. One of the ways to think about this is think of Christopher Columbus. So we have all the historia about Christopher Columbus. We know what is the date he set sail from Spain. We know how many ships he had. We know the names of each of those ships. We know when he landed upon the new world thinking that that is India. We know which king patronized him, funded all of those endeavors. But have we actually internalized the reality that Christopher was a Rakshas? What he did to his fellow human beings? And what that means and what learning should that come from what human beings should be doing when they meet new communities, new cultures? None of that learning has come from all of the history of Christopher Columbus. So what is the point of a history devoid of an itihas? That is the question that Professor Balgangadhar, Vishwa Adluri also raised. And that is the first challenge we must throw to modern history when we talk about an Indic view of history. That आप जिस चीज को भी इतिहास बोल रहे हैं, उसका लाभ क्या है? What is the point of it? And what I call my past and my story, at least I can talk about the benefits of it. It has informed my values, my ethics, my dharma, generation after generation for thousands of years. Can you say that much for your own history, even of 20 years, even of 40 years, even of 400 years? That's the first challenge we must internalize and throw back at history. So that is the broad meaning or sense of itihas. Now we can move forward, we can move at the second aspect of it. The second aspect is of chronology, because this is also a very important point that keeps coming up. In fact, this is often used to say that Indians had no sense of history. क्योंकि हम बता तो पाते नहीं हैं कि okay, when did Sri Vishwamitra live? When did Vasishtha Maitravaruni live? How many Vasishthas were there? How many Brihaspatis were there? When did Sri Ram live? When did Sri Krishna live? When did Bhishma lay on the bed of arrows? When did Bhishma finally give up his soul? All of these different dates, ये तो हम दे नहीं पाते हैं. So does that reduce the validity of our history? Does that reduce the validity of our memory? And on the point of history without chronology, again there are some paradigms, some things to consider. Well, there's a quote here by another thinker, philosopher, Michel de Certeau. He says that when we recast in the mold of a taxonomic ordering of things, chronology, it recasts people's stories in a taxonomic ordering of things. And therefore, actually time becomes an alibi. It becomes a way of making the use of time without reflecting on it, which is what's happened in the Christopher Columbus example that I gave to you, for example. So we have all the dates, but those dates have become an alibi. They have become a means to fool ourselves that yes, we know the past, but we have not learned from it, we haven't reflected upon it. So chronology leads us down a false path and sense of satisfaction. It makes us think we are learning something, but in reality we are learning nothing. And in any case, if anyone is observing the chronological battles in India, then it just creates enemies out of people who actually should be on the same side of history anyway. My date versus your date versus my date, this has become ego battles. So, and that is the danger of good intentions that we're already warned about. So that is one caution and caveat to keep about chronology. And so there is another paper by Professor Stephen Tanaka, that is the name of this paper, History Without Chronology. So in that he says that history must embrace the richness and variability of different times that exist throughout our life. So now another sense here, that chronology actually just takes a linear calendar sense of time. But actually there are different times and different ways of looking at time, different ways of relating to time, which are all contingent and varied in the way that people's own stories about the past vary. So it is evident in non-modern societies and in historical writings about them. And to be clear, this is not a way of conceiving of a history shorn of time, of a history without physical or successive causality, which is to say we are not taking all of our ancestors and placing them in some kind of static, timeless limbo. But we are asserting that we are not going to use one specific chronological view of time as the only way of understanding the movement of a people, as the only way of understanding the emergence of a civilization and collective will among a people. We will incorporate lots of different times. So we're not arguing for an end of history. In fact, we're arguing for a beginning of true itihas of a people, when we understand that chronology and the current limitations that chronology actually imposes upon how we look at time and how we relate with time. So instead, what actually chronology does, it actually orders a structure, an ordered mechanical life. And it kind of reduces the humanism of our stories, because ideas, culture, interpretations, ethics, all of these work in different ways, they emerge in different ways, and they offer civilizational markers and milestones. So civilization markers and milestones may not be measured just in year on year. They may be measured according to great deeds, they may be measured according to great events, and floods, for example, are a big marker in a lot of world civilizations. And most importantly, because of this single arrow of time that it imposes and a kind of delusion of progression that it imposes, it guiles us into thinking that we are better than those who came before. Right? This is the current paradigm of historicism and even of historical progress, that actually all of history is the story of humanity somehow emerging more and more out of darkness, out of primitivism, out of superstition. And it's a single arrow such that every single year, every single day, we are better, more intelligent somehow than those that came before us. That's the delusion it actually gives to us. But in reality, and of course, yes, some other critiques, it emphasizes the idea of succession. We just talked about that. Modern history, this is what it operates on. It operates on this outmoded notion of time. But in reality, there are actually different times. There's of course physical happenings, there are rhythms of chronobiology, how people relate to the land, to the seasons, to the waxing and waning of rivers change courses, etc. And the rhythms of assemblages of human institutions, human societies, human organizations. There are all different ways of looking at time. And even in the sciences, mind you, this is true. Because even in the sciences now, absolute time, it coexists with relative and quantum times. So science has also come to understand that depending on the paradigm, the zoom level that we use, we actually operate on different kinds of time. If this is true for the universe, how can this not be true for human societies, human trajectories? So that's an important thing to understand. And even calendars are not actually, historical calendars were not used just to show passage. Calendars are not clocks, right? Calendars are actually used to mark the passage of time, place, significance, meaning, all of these things, which shows that human beings relate to time in different ways. And so Stephen Tanaka says that by unleashing history from chronological time, we might once again allow history to be also a form of communication about past and their relevance to the present. So again, that recurring theme, that the past, the history, itihas, whatever you call it, it has to be a mirror. It has to be something that can inform you, that you can reflect upon. And if it is not that, then you have reduced its dimensionality. You have actually sanitized it and mechanized it, which removes all of its original objectives. So, and another quote by Aaron Gurevich, that both space and time are axiological and emotionally charged. Time and space can be good or evil. There is a sacral time. In fact, when you look at the Itihas Puran corpus, it could be argued that the Itihas Puran corpus is a history of how ancient Indians engaged with the sacred and the divine. That is what it is truly a history of. And in return, how the sacred and the divine engaged with ancient Indians. So the epics are actually a story of how the original consciousness itself descended onto this bhumi of Bharatvarsh and played out different acts and deeds in mortal form. All the stories of the Purans are stories about various devtas, various yakshas, so many non-material entities. Modern science will allow us to use that language for them. So in many ways, the whole Itihas Puran corpus is actually a sacred history of ancient India's engagement with sacred time. And we see that also when they talk about yugs and manvantars, how time stretches and waxes and wanes in different contexts in the Purans. And therefore, there are sacred places or whole worlds subject to special forces, and they can be very much a part of a people's story of the past. But just using the historical chronological lens will not reveal that to us and will actually beguile us and lead us astray. And so what we today call the past, things that have happened prior and distinct, it was not distant nor different. Inherited ideas that were important enough to be retained were of the present. Another important point. So there is a degree of eternality in time as well. It's the very word that gives to us Sanatan in Dharma. Sanatan means eternal. It is perennially renewed. So there are so many things in quote unquote history, but they are not in the past. They live with us in the here and now. And so many of us can attest to our own experiences growing up when we heard the stories of Karna, when we heard the stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Are they not told to us as moral lessons for today? Does it not matter? It doesn't matter, right? How many thousands of years ago those stories might have been. Those lessons, those learnings, they become civilizational archetypes that are forever hung in space for us to pull from and learn from. So that those are ways in which it transcends, the chronological ordering of time. And so many of those are eternally things of the present. And so there are three times: a present of past things, a present of present things, and a present of future things. And these are orderings that we actually see in how the Purans especially talk about time. So different types of time, we can think of the times of physics. In the Purans also this is there, we come across it in different metaphors, but it is about a day and night of Brahma, a day and night of Vishnu, how many years does Brahma sleep and what does that mean for the age of the universe itself. Those kind of calculations are done and possible. There is biotemporality, which is also there in the Purans. It brings in the various rhythms of organisms and societies. There is a concept of 100 years of human beings leads to 1 year of the Devatas and so on. So there is an ordering. There is also nootemporality, the human apprehension of time. You could be arguing that manvantars are actually a sense of that. We will come to that concept a bit later. And sociotemporality, which is the particular system people formulate to make sense of their world, which is the idea of the yugas, the ascending cycles, the descending cycles of the yugas, the cyclicality of the yugas. And these are just examples from the Indian context, but all societies have these different types of time. And of course, then there is cyclical time. Which comes to us also through the works of Sri Aurobindo, but it is there even in the Puranic concept of time, because Brahma springs from the navel of Vishnu, he engages in creation, he is awake for 150 of his years, he is asleep for 50 of his years, then he folds back into the navel of Vishnu, Vishnu again sleeps, then Vishnu will wake up again, out Brahma will spring again, and this will go on in an eternal cycle, right? So that cyclicality is there, but at a human level, it is also the concept of helicality. Helicality is a progression in cyclicality. So a cycle is just round, 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 it's like a wheel. But imagine the spring. So when you move along a spring, you are not just rotating, but you are also actually moving along an axis, right? And that is the concept of time in India also, that there are ascending and descending cycles. So it's not so much that we are returned to the same source over and over again, but it's that we are taking a circular pattern of life, but we are constantly in motion in some direction. So that's the notion of helicality. And helical time is also very evident in the Indian view of things. And so we finally come to this quotation, which definitely inspires and informs me when I try to look at Indian history, when I try to think of ancient Indian history, by Sri K.M. Munshi. So he says that the central purpose of a history must be to investigate and unfold the values which age after age have inspired the inhabitants of a country to develop their collective will and to express it through the manifold activities of their life. That is what a purpose of a history is. And he's lamented, of course, that such a history of India is still to be written. So when I first read this, yes, I read this as a kind of lament, and a kind of sadness washed over me that yes, such a history of India is still to be written. But actually it's a call to action. Actually it inspires us that now there is some work that we can also do. Because how tragic would it be if all the work is done? हमारे लिए कुछ करने को बचा ही नहीं. But thankfully, Sri K.M. Munshi said that yes, there is work to be done, so do not despair, just get to it. And that is the Indic view of history that we have to then now excavate and inspire ourselves by. So when we now look at this as a kind of tabular comparison, history, yes, it has events of the past, what happened when, who did what, who ruled when did this happen, when did that happen. These are the stuff of history, historia. And contrast this with itihas, which of course, yes, there is a etymological literal meaning of so it was, tradition or legend, but it has some properties. It is reflective, it is reflexive, it is self-aware, and it is a civilizational memory in conversation with itself. That is what itihas is. And so when we appraise these against what we have always been learning and what our history teachers taught us from day one, that history is important. Why? Because we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. History is important for us to learn lessons and inform ourselves with. When we look at it in that sense, then what is all of this history giving to us? I am not too sure. I put a question mark here. But all of this itihas has actually given to us this vast body that we can call dharma. And it informs us on how was it articulated, how was it formulated, how was it followed, not followed, what were the battles that were fought to uphold it, and what were the actions that were taken to preserve it, the knowledge systems, the stories, all of that emerges from the itihas and dharma record. So this is a way to understand some fundamental differences in history and itihas. But these differences are also not irreconcilable. These differences have arisen today because we have lost ourselves to that original sense of history, that it was an imperative to actually unite and reconcile all stories of all peoples against one common story of one particular desert tribe in Arabia. Now once we are free from that, once we are no longer bound by it because we have recognized it, then we can actually engage in all of this, but we can engage in all of this on our own terms. And that opens the view to a modern Indian history, which is inspired and informed by Bharatiya Itihas. So when we do that, we also have to keep one thing in mind, which is the importance of history and historiography, etc., in cultural, social, colonial, political narratives. And to give an example here, I will spend some time on what we can broadly call the Aryan invasion, migration, trickling in paradigm. It's of course a very, very broad field. We can have a whole course just on that. But what do I want to bring out of that today? Now this theory, first of all, is not a base theory. It's actually a corollary of another theory. It's an implication of another theory. And that theory is linguistic at heart. So there is a theory. It says that if we look at various different language families in modern Eurasia, they seem to be related to each other. Indian language, North Indian language family, it's called the Indo-Aryan language families, Iranian, Greek, Germanic, Italic, Baltic, Balto-Slavic, and there are some extinct languages as well, Anatolian, Tocharian, Hittite, etc. So the theory is that all of these language families, they seem to have descended from a common mother language. And because these language families are called Indo-European, that hypothetical mother language is called Proto-Indo-European. Now the moment we arrive at this, some questions arise that okay, who spoke Proto-Indo-European or PIE? When was it spoken? Where was it spoken? And the moment you place a mark X anywhere in Eurasia, okay, this is where it originated from, you are automatically implying some kind of Aryan invasion, migration to everywhere else in Eurasia, where the daughter languages are there. This is the basic paradigm. But are the Greeks told that you are not Greeks, you actually came from outside? Are the Germanic tribes told that no, your ancestors were actually Russians, you are not native to your land? Are the Iranians told that you are not inheritors of Iranian civilization? Are the Romans told you are not inheritors of the Latin and Roman civilization? Only in India do we find our eminent historians writing books with the title, Which of Us Are Aryans? Whereas if Proto-Indo-European is true, then by definition it originated somewhere, तो बाकी हर जगह तो Aryan invasion migration हुआ ही, तो Anglo-Saxons को भी यही बोलिए, तो Nordics को भी यही बोलिए, Greeks को भी यही बोलिए, Italics को भी यही बोलिए, नहीं, सिर्फ भारत में, even if this story is true, only in Bharat is it used to create fault lines and divisions. Because if the story is true, it is equally true for Italy also, for Spain also, for Greece also, but nowhere else is this problem. And we are not even rejecting this theory अभी हम उस theory को refute करने पे आए भी नहीं. हम तो कह रहे हैं even if we accept it on face value, only in the case of India is it used to draw fault lines, such that some of us are told that no, your ancestors came from outside. Some of us are told no, there is a north versus south divide in you. Some of us are told no, there was linguistic oppression, there was caste oppression. Some white blonde haired people came and they imposed this on the rest of you, so your own culture is not native to you. So this is an example of where if we do not get into these domains, if we take the luxury of sticking to our view of history and itihas and being happy with it, it will still be used as a political tool to divide and conquer, to divide and rule. Which is to say that even if we are not interested in history, to borrow phrasing Pankaj uses in a different context, history and historiography is interested in us. And so we have to be ready for it, we have to be prepared for it. All of the Indic view of time and history, etc., will be of no use if we are just discussing it in our comfortable couches and sofas, but this continues to happen. Right? So this is a reason why we have to get into the history game, even if we understand some of its flaws, some of its shortcomings, because the counter narratives to this have to be given. And then anyway add to this the fact that this whole theory, of course, has many ways to be debunked and refuted. Keep in mind that it is anyway linguistic theory. We know that languages and genes don't move together. We are speaking in English here today, none of us have British genes in our DNA. Chess has spread all over the world, that doesn't mean that people have Indic genes or that chess players have Indic genes. Genghis Khan's DNA is there in so much of Eurasia, but Mongolia today is primarily a Buddhist country. Which means to say culture, language, all of these things move very different to genetics. This is very obvious. But today we are starting to hear things about how ये देखो अब तो genetics में ही prove हो गया है कि Aryans इस समय आए थे, Aryans उस समय आए थे. Right? So this is why we have to be aware of all of these fields, and I give this example for us to get that sense in a deeper way. So therefore now we have to ask this question. Can history and itihas coexist? We have looked at the differences in these views. We have understood some of the shortcomings of the historical lens. We have understood how chronology itself is a limiting enterprise. But we have also seen that this is a tool, this is a political tool, and therefore we have to be aware of it. It can be weaponized against us. So now we arrive at a fundamental question, can they coexist? Of course, I believe that they can. Because let's ask ourselves, what do the stories of past reveal of the people who lived them? Is archaeology as it arrives to us, is it mute? Does it not give us any details? Is the material culture that is evident in a landscape devoid of oral and cultural histories or exclusive to oral and cultural histories? So let us think in fact of some pioneers. We can be sure that they existed at some time. वो कब थे, we will not get into that, but we are sure that they existed. For example, would there not have been at some point some masters of mantra, the pioneers of ancient sound and mind and the instruments and technologies that now today descend to us in the form of mantra science? They would have been at some point or the other, obviously. Similarly, would there not have been the first agriculturalists, the first people who were pioneers of food and nourishment? And therefore, there would have been some time, right, in ancient past and even in India when people were first subsisting on wild berries, on raw grain. But then there would have come a time when they started to, indulge in agriculture, plow the soil, to use irrigation. These things would have happened at some point. Similarly, there would have been some daredevils that first tamed the bull, the bison, the elephant. There would have been ancestors who saw the first monarchs, the first time great leaders arose. There would have been time when we heard the first rishis who had their drishtis and started to utter their transcendent realizations in mantric and Sanskritic syntax. Ye sab hua hoga at some point. And similarly, ancestors who charted through the ancient forests, who went to the river mouths, who figured out this is where Ganga originates, this is where Saraswati originates, this is where Yamuna originates. Ye sab hua hoga. So we have to ask ourselves that what do we think that all of the stories we have in the Itihas and Puran, are they exclusive to all of this? Do we really want to think that all of these people are in some separate space-time coordinate and all the stories that Itihas and Puran are talking about are some separate space-time coordinate? They are talking about the same world, obviously. Because we know that humans have been living in this subcontinent for thousands of years. And we have stories of what humans were doing for thousands of years in Bharatvarsh. So how long do we want to pretend that these stories are not talking about the same shared universe and geography and same shared journey through space-time? It's a kind of dichotomy that even comes to us when we look at Indus Valley civilization, for example. And here again David Frolligi talks about this. How curious is it that Indus Valley civilization, the world's largest civilization of its time, it was double in size than the size of Egypt and Sumer combined, its contemporary civilizations. That's how vast it was. How curious is it now, some people might know of Bharat Rao J. Yajnadevam, who's saying that he might have deciphered the script. But were we talking just 6 months ago? The civilization actually mute to us. Indus Valley civilization doesn't speak to us. Script has not been deciphered conclusively. It doesn't tell us anything about itself. On the same side, we have the world's largest literature corpus, which is the Vedic literature corpus, which speaks of cities, civilizations, life and being. And how curious is it that we have taken these two to be separate things. Whereas clearly they have been talking about the same geography, the same arcs of time, the same ways of living and being. So that same dichotomy we would do if we pretend that the Itihas Puran corpus is not talking about all the stories that archaeology also tells us, that linguistics also tells us, that to many extents even genetics also tells us. So therefore it's not even about we have to find a coexistence between history and Itihas. They already have compatibilities. Once we remove from history the limitations that were imposed on it in terms of chronology, in terms of trying to find out one true story about the past. In fact, history sings and rhymes very well with Itihas. So I'll give you an example now of the same genetic thing. So if you look at the genetics data of Japan, of Japanese genetical ancestry, we find that the earliest maternal DNA of Japan has its roots in the Indian subcontinent, some 28,000 years ago. Now when you find maternal ancestry, there is actually a very important point. Because when humans migrate to a new land where there is previously no habitation, both men and women have to migrate. Only then can you establish a population enough for it to start growing. So if you find this in Japan, for example, that the maternal ancestry is rooted in India, that means when the first women who came to Japan, descendants of India, Japan was uninhabited. They were the first settlers of Japan. Now number one, are we going to go to Japan today and start telling them, no, some of you are original Indian ancestries, some of you are later Japanese ancestries? No, we don't do that. It's done only in the case of India. But more importantly, when you look at the Puranic record, it speaks of through the first Manvantar, second Manvantar, third Manvantar of Indians migrating out of India in huge bands. Whenever there were tribes that were losing, some tribes were exiled. They were the sons of Priyavrat, who was the son of Swayambhuv Manu, the first Manu. And Priyavrat and his sons colonized the entire known geography of that time. And this is exactly what we find when we trace genetic records as far as to Japan or to Australia or to Papua New Guinea. This doesn't mean we have to become as ridiculous and absurd as the Indologists become about these things. But it tells us that when, if needed, we can also arm ourselves accordingly. And we can play that game because we know how it is played and we have the information necessary to play that game. This is one of the ways in which India can and should reconcile itihas and history, right? So now a sense of time and chronology, of course, we have also had. We have yugs, manvantars, various calendar systems. We'll get to some of that in deeper detail. There is a sense of genealogical time because extensive genealogies have been given for ancient Indian dynasties, especially the Suryavansh dynasty, the Somavansh dynasty. And genealogical time is also a way in which various ancient civilizations have actually measured themselves. The Egyptians also had extensive genealogies. Sumer also had extensive genealogies. When the Greeks came to India and after Alexander, in Megasthenes' writings, though his writings, Indica is not available to us, we hear of his writings through later historians who quoted him. He talks about how India has a record of 153 kings over a period of some 6,000 plus years, right? So that genealogical sense of time has been there in the Indian itihas. There is of course a sense of sacred time, which is how the yugas intersect with the lifetime itself of Brahma, with the day and night of Brahma, and then the life of Vishnu himself. And there are compatibilities with other pasts and other histories. So if you look at what the Egyptians were thinking about their own past at that time, what the Sumerians were thinking, how ancient civilizations have looked at time itself. It's very interesting that actually all ancient civilizations tended to think of themselves as successors and descendants of some before them. So even the Greeks actually looked at Egyptians early on as an elder civilization. It's only later when their military aggression, etc., became enough to colonize Egypt that they started to look down upon Egypt, which is pretty much similar to how Europe also engaged with India. But the Greeks looked to Egyptians as an elder civilization, and the Egyptians talked of Atlantis before them, from which they said civilization has fallen actually, right? So these are ways in which it is compatible. This sense of deep time and past eras of time are there in not just Indian itihas, but other civilizations as well. And then there is a sense about the way that Purans are structured, which we will get to, because the way Purans are structured itself tells us a lot about the Indian view of history and time. Now let us understand something about prehistory. By technical definitions, prehistory is the era of humanity before writing and record keeping, right? It's the era of humanity before writing and record keeping. Now, as far as what we currently know, human beings or modern Homo sapiens have been around for at least 300,000 years, at least 3 lakh years. From what we currently know, this date may be pushed back further with new discoveries. But writing itself reaches back 5,000, maximum 6,000 years or so, which is to say that writing is less than 0.1% of humanity's past. So if prehistory is the era of humanity before writing and record keeping, then 99.9% of the human trajectory is in the realm of prehistory. Because writing to bahut hi nayi baat hai in comparison. So what this means is that a people's cultural histories, oral histories cannot be negated so easily. Because 99.9% of all people's sense of the past will be in that. So now when we look at what was happening in prehistory, just some glimpses for us to get a broad sense. There is a sense of the Miocene era, it's called, which is around 20 million years ago. This is the era of the great apes. And in fact, the line that we share with gorillas, that split around 13 million years ago. The line that we share with chimpanzees, that split around some 7 million years ago. So 20 million years ago, the era of great apes, in a sense, even humans or any human prehistory hasn't really arrived. When by human we mean Homo sapiens. But if by human we mean hominids or other cousin species to us, then even prehistory actually goes back a long time. And please keep in mind, it's not actually an absurd claim to make. But if there have been human beings who are able to talk to each other, who are able to share stories, then there would have been histories even then. There would have been legendary men and women even then. There would have been kings and conquerors and villains and monsters even then. Whether or not those stories have descended and continued and survived is a different story. But there is nothing in science or rationality that should make us exclude the very idea of this. That would be a silly thing to do. And 5 million years ago, the era of it's called proto-human beings. Then around 2 million years ago, the era of hominids. And in fact, even in Homo sapiens, there is a sense of two species of Homo sapiens. There is the Homo sapiens idaltu, which means the elder Homo sapiens. And then there is Homo sapiens sapiens, which is anatomically modern Homo sapiens, you and I. And that's around 300,000 years ago. So that's a broad trajectory, and modern Homo sapiens, actually came 150,000 years ago, which is us. So that's a broad curve, and of course once we came about, then we also have the ideas of stone ages, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic era, and then the metal ages. After the metal ages come, very soon we see writing, we see the advent of the material qualifiers of civilization that we use, wheel, agriculture, long distance trade, etc. That's a very broad trajectory. But in any case, there are some things that we should keep in mind, which tell us about, I'll cover it here only, no problem, which tell us about how we should be circumspect and how we should have some reservation towards certitudes in all of this. So take two examples. Take the example of the wheel and take the example of agriculture. Now when we think about the invention of the wheel, so when we think of the wheel, the best explanation we have is at some point some human being saw either a round stone rolling down or saw a tumbleweed rolling and got the intuition that a rounder substance can move easier, and therefore at some point the wheel came about. Similarly for agriculture, it is said that human beings were initially hunter-gatherers, they were nomads, and what happened at some point was in one season they ate raw berries or raw grain and discarded the seeds, and then they migrated on, but a season later when they came back to this land, they saw that where they had thrown seeds, now food has grown. So they were able to intuit the causality that actually we can put seed in the ground and we can grow plants ourselves. But both the wheel and agriculture are traced back to within the last 10,000 years. But modern Homo sapiens have been around for at least 150, 300,000 years. And modern Homo sapiens means that they were as clever as you and I. They were as capable of inference, deduction, etc. as you and I. They were as possessed as the powers of observation of nature and the cycles of nature as you and I. In fact, we might have degraded because of our usage and reliance on technology. So how weird is it that for 300,000 years human beings have been around, but for 290,000 of those years there was no one clever enough to think of a wheel or agriculture? Which is to say that there anyway exist large gaps in our understanding of the human past. And with the certainties that we currently talk about things, those certainties are not merited when we really get into the crux of the matter. So that's something to keep in mind. When we look at this specifically in the Indian context, just some broad milestones, there is a sense of the Sohanian culture, it's called, which is around 400 to 200,000 years. YBP means years before present. So at that stage we stop using BC, before Christ. It would be quite ridiculous if we continue to count 2 lakh years before Christ. So therefore we start reaching YBP, कि एक time from Christ को पीछे छोड़ देते हैं. So it's named after river Sohan, which is a tributary of the Indus, and it ranges in the modern Shivalik hills to northern Pakistan, which basically talks about, it gives us evidence that hominid inhabitation in the Indian subcontinent is very old, and which means to say that whatever have been the hominid psychologies, whatever might have been the shared experiences, legends, etc., that hominids were descending or passing down among themselves, they were definitely happening in the Indian subcontinent as well. There is also, it's called the Acheulean culture. It's derived, the name of this derives from a specific type of tools, etc., that were first found in France. From there the name comes, but it pervades across Eurasia, a large belt and swath of Eurasia. It has characteristics of stone usage. In India it's found from the Shivalik hills right down to modern Chennai. So again giving a sense of the spread and extent of hominid species at a particular time. And it is dated to around 200,000 years before present, which means that very much the era of Homo sapiens. There's also to keep in mind with this that there are some geological considerations. Number one, what we have today, the Thar desert, it didn't exist till recently. In fact, the Thar desert is just a few thousand years old. So the very geography of India was actually quite different at that time. And also as sea levels rise and wane, the coastline of India would also be changing. And if you look at southern India, actually in southern India only near the coastlines do you actually have plain land where agriculture and these activities can happen. Otherwise it's all hills and jagged land. So that area would have waxed and waned, and not for nothing do we find this memory. In the Purans also we have of course memory of great floods. In the Tamil Sangam tradition also it is said that the first 3 Sangams happened in Madurais that are now lost to the sea, right? And when the great tsunami came, I don't know if we had followed it, then as the sea had temporarily receded when the tsunami was coming, then the people off the coast of India testified to this. They saw constructions and various human artifacts buried deep under the ocean floor, which means that there is a lot of story of humanity, and in India's case even of India, which is now buried under the ocean floor. right? But that's something we should keep in mind. So that's a broad sense of Indian prehistory. And then all of this intersects with geological time. Geological time is the earth keeping a sense of time and rhythm for itself. But we can deduce it, we can discern it, and we can try and map ourselves to it in some ways. The broadest geological time that happens on this planet is actually the waxing and waning of the ice sheets. So in broad, there comes one extreme of this when all the ice, all the water, most of the water on the planet gets locked into the polar ice caps and in the glaciers. So the river waters get locked into the glaciers that sit at the top of mountains, and ocean waters get locked into the polar ice caps. This at one end, when this is the maximum, it's called the glacial maximum. And then at the other end is when all of this melts, or most of this melts, such that ocean levels are the highest and such that the rivers are the most bountiful. Right? When we look at the Rig Veda, we actually find these metaphors. So these memories are also there in Indian time, because the entire battle of Indra and Vritra in one level is a battle, or it represents this memory of all the world waters being locked. So Vritra is described as a dragon that keeps the Maho Arnaha, the great waters, locked up, which represents this period when all of it is captured in ice. And then Indra, of course, vanquishes him. Not for nothing is Indra also venerated as a monsoon god or a rain god, as a bringer of rain and prosperity. And once Indra achieves victory, then these waters are unlocked and down flows the Saraswati, which is Naditame Ambitame, the greatest of all rivers, Giribhya Samudrat, from the mountain to the ocean. Right? So those are the ways in which geological time waxes and wanes. And that's the concept of the glacial maximums. So the last glacial period, which means when there was maximum ice coverage, that was between 115,000 years before present to somewhere broadly around 11,000, 12,000 years before present, right? And in this, there is a concept of the last glacial maximum. So the glacial maximum is the time when there is a maximum locking up of things into ice. So somewhere around 22 to 25,000 years ago is considered the last glacial maximum. These become population and civilizational bottlenecks. So for example, at the last glacial maximum, from northern India right up to Beijing, there was permafrost. Life and civilization couldn't thrive. And in fact, only the Tibetan plateau was a kind of population survival area where human beings could survive. And not for nothing, the earliest barley or proto-barley, the earliest domesticated equid, etc., are actually often traced to the Tibetan plateau. And perhaps not for nothing, even Adi Yogi and Adi Shiv is also traced right up to there. Because maybe it is quite possible that those population bottlenecks then, when the glacial maximum receded, became the sources and repositories of civilization to once again spring out through those bottleneck areas. So that's how geological time impacts life and living and human being. And then there was another minor ice age, it's called the Younger Dryas era. There are many theories of what caused it, but again somewhere around 12,000, 10,000 years before present, there were a few thousand years of another ice age kind of conditions. And it is at the end of this that actually all that we currently put in the realm of civilization and history emerges. So somewhere around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, the effects were over, and that is considered the beginning of the Holocene era. So 9,500 BC, etc. के आसपास immediately we find the emergence of monumental architecture, which is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the pyramid, the Giza plateau in Egypt. We see now the beginnings of rudimentary agriculture, first with just converting some wild grains into actual grain, then by 6,000, 7,000 BCE at places like Mehergarh, which is in modern Balochistan near Quetta, we start seeing year-round agriculture, which means they have figured out how to do irrigation all year round. And then very quickly we see ceramics, pottery, etc. emerge. By 3000, 4000 BCE, all what we may define as modern civilization is well and flourishing, Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, etc. So that's the broad trajectory of how humanity currently understands its place and its relationship within time. And yes, we see the appearance of agriculture, animal husbandry, pottery, etc. in the archaeological record. So in this, some unknowns, I have mentioned some of this already, but even if we know all of this, we need to be aware and be humble to what we don't know. We don't know, for example, the cultural, aesthetic, linguistic, material nature of ancient hominid species. In fact, it's still up for debate, did they even possess language or not. But whether or not they possess language, it's quite clear or evident that even the Neanderthals, for example, had as much a conscious experience as we did. And that is why they are also homogeneous, so they are also human beings. right? We tend to think of human beings only as us, but actually till some time ago there were other human species on this planet. But we don't know whether they had cultural, aesthetic, etc. Markers as well. In fact, at the conspiracy corners or the fun conspiracy corners of ancient history, there are people who speculate that even in the Purans, the memory of the Devtas are the Neanderthals, the Asuras are the Denisovans, and then the Manushas are the human beings. I mean, there's no support for any of this, but that's how people have also tended to speculate on these kind of things, but we don't know. It's an unknown, right? Then we also do not know, did the Neanderthals have language, did they have religion? It's an open kind of question, and also it throws into question our sense and definition of these things. So when we look at language, consciousness itself, is consciousness human kind of consciousness? Is it something that one day there was an ape parent and us parent ka bachcha conscious human being paida ho gaya? So which is to say, was it one discrete event in the history of our species, or was it actually a trajectory such that over a long period of generations, at one end we may find an ape which is fit in the forest, but at the other end we find a modern Homo sapien. We don't know. There might have been a gradient to these things, and we don't know the nature of human interactions while this gradient was developing. So that's also an unknown. We don't know the apparent discreteness of milestone events. That's exactly what I mentioned. I talked about the wheel and the agriculture. The impact of population bottlenecks, such as the one that I mentioned, younger Dryas. How did that impact ethno-linguistic, genetic boundaries between human species? When there is a population bottleneck, so much information gets lost. How much information is retained? In fact, when you look at the Indian lore, it's very interesting. In most world cultures, a global flood or a cataclysmic flood, it signifies an end of times. So Atlantis was destroyed in a great flood, for example. But in the Indian tradition, in most cases, a flood is the beginning of times. So the very Manvantar we are in, the 7th Manvantar, this began with a great flood, where Matsya Avatar incarnated and warned Vaivaswat Manu about it. The very first Manvantar also began with a great flood, when Swayambhuv Manu then prayed to Vishnu to come and help raise the earth back from the submerged levels, and that is when the Varaha Avatar had actually come. Right? So in the Indian lore, actually even cataclysms are markers of a new beginning. They're not markers of an end, and that tells us something about the continuing nature of Indian memory and also the way it looks at civilizations in a rise and fall kind of way. It comes later somewhere in the slide, but it's pertinent here, where in the Purans it's written that civilizations fall and rise, annihilation and destruction happen in all ages. The wise ones are not deluded in this respect. So that wisdom was there in the Indian sense of time. Yeah, and yes, we don't know what happened when and how that changed stone tool using hominids at some point to art painting, music making, language weaving human beings, right? So there is a band of uncertainty. And whenever we see modern historians, anthropologists, etc., being very confident about their reading of ancient time and being very dismissive of the deep sense of time other civilizations and cultures have had, we should keep these things in mind. They are pretending to know more than they actually do. They are pretending to be more certain than their knowledge actually warrants and certifies. So this is something we have to be aware of. Then now let us come to the Indian sense of timekeeping. Well, of course, we have different calendars. There is the Samvat calendar, Vikram Samvat, Shaka Samvat. This is the eras in which they began. We are currently in the year 2082 of Vikram Samvat. Is that correct? 2082 of Vikram Samvat. There are other calendars. They are called the Kal or era calendars. So they began in different, eras or epochs of ancient Indian history. Gupta Kal, Kalachuri or Chedi Kal. There is the Harsha era. And then there are of course lots of units of timekeeping. So there is the Samvat, Varsh, Mas, which is month. There is the idea of the Paksh, the Saptaha, the Tithi, the Divas, the Muhurt. So all of which is to say that of course Indians knew how to clock and keep time. It's not that they had no sense of this altogether. And then there is the idea of the Yugs and Manvantars. Very important idea, very confounding idea, very perplexing idea. But some things to keep in mind. Once we understand the multiplicity of how Indians looked at ancient time, the nature of how these stories are now available to us, what we need to understand is that there need not be one definite chronology of ancient Indian history. Why? Because there is not a singular or definite framework for the Yugs and Manvantars. If we try to start finding one singular definite framework, we are doing the same mistake of ordering all of this across chronological time. Whereas we know that there are so many different kinds of time, and the complexity of Yugs and Manvantars actually represents that very multiplicity of time. So to think that all of ancient literature across time, whether in the Purans or then in the Surya Siddhant or then in some astronomical texts, in the Dharma Shastra, in the Upanishad, all of it is somehow magically just using one singular framework of Yuga and Manvantar. And that's quite wrong and unfounded. We have no reason to actually assert or think this kind of thing. As a means of cosmic timekeeping, in fact, there were many layers. There was an esoteric layer of yugas, there was an astronomical layer of yugas, there was a historic layer of yugas. And when it says that this happened in this and this yug, or that happened in that and that yug, we are not necessarily assured that they are talking about the single one yuga system. And how do we know this? Because ever since the Purans, as many commentators and chronologists have been there, that many interpretations of yugas and manvantars have been there. Right? If it was such a simple and straightforward thing, then we shouldn't actually be having so many varied views, so many varied opinions. But some things do actually line up. So there is a sense of the long cycle of the yugas and a sense of a shorter cycle of yugas. The long cycle, when we put all together, it somehow totals up to somewhere around 4.32 million years. And when you use a shorter cycle, it rounds up to somewhere around 12,000 years. Now this number 12,000 is very interesting. Because number one, it lines up nearly with the beginning of the Holocene period. So when the Younger Dryas ended and the new window of the Holocene humanity actually opened up, that lines up very well with this 12,000 year cycle. Secondly, there is the science of the precession of the earth. So the earth actually does not spin just as a straight line. It has a wobble to its spin. And that wobble takes somewhere around 24,000 years. So now if the yugas themselves total up to 12,000 years, and even in yugas, there is a sense of a descending cycle and then an ascending cycle. So it goes from Satyug to Kali Yuga, but then back to Satyug. That in total will take up 24,000 years. Coincidentally, that lines up quite well with the precession of the equinoxes ka period. Right? So these are just some compatibilities. None of this has to be taken as hills to be dying on. Once again, if we do that, then we are losing the very purpose of all of this. Right? So, but it's important to mention, and I mention this just so that we know that सिर्फ हवा में बात नहीं हो रही. So when we start trying to assert the Indian view of history, the Indian paradigm, these are some of the questions and challenges that may come to us. So we should know that, look, there are various compatibilities here. At the very least, it's as compatible as some other alternate accounting theory, if not more. Right? Now, so the Puranic lens is what? There is a sense of the Panch Lakshan, the 5 properties that every Puran should have. And examining them and their meaning actually tells us what the Indian view of history truly is and what India considered the history or the past of its own people, its own civilization. So all Purans are supposed to begin with what is called Sarg. It's an account of primary or primordial creation. So it is in this section that we find cosmology and cosmogony, the origin and nature of the universe. We find the stories or theories on the creation of elements, of mind itself, of manas, mahat, consciousness, metaphysics, the formation of lokas. So in fact, Indian history begins not at 4004 BCE or not with the descent of a god, not even with the arrival of an avatar. It begins at the absolute beginning, whatever you may think of that as. And the absolute beginning is actually only the latest unfolding of the dream of supreme consciousness, through which all of this unfolds. Usse pehle bhi raha hoga, uske baad bhi rahega, because it's all cyclical in nature. Then all Purans have what is called Pratisarga, which is an account of secondary creation. So Sarg is primordial creation. Pratisarg sections deal with the cyclicality of the universe. The fact that the universe waxes and wanes. It's born, then folds back into itself, and then comes back out. And it also talks about how through this cyclicality, there are events, people, activities and deeds that restore dharma, knowledge, civilization age after age. So that is the primary thread within the Indian sense of time and history. It is an account of the preservation, transmission, restoration of dharma age after age. And what is dharma in the Indian sense? Of course, there are many definitions. We would have heard them in the past couple of days. But at the very least, it is a system for human flourishing, happiness and prosperity, which we have began with, that is to be the original objective of history. So in fact, the Purans are very well compatible with the true objectives of history, itihas, whatever we may call it. Then there is a section called Vansh or genealogies. So this is where we find the account of the Surya Vansh, the Som Vansh dynasties, genealogies of various devatas, various rishis, and a hierarchy of beings in the universe. There are Asurs, Gandharvas, Yakshas, Kinnars, Kim Purushas, Charans, Garuds, so many different beings and creatures in the universe, and it gives an account of all of them. Then there is the Manvantarani, the cycle of the Manus or the Manvantars. So here the role, the names of each of the Manus are given. Stories are given how age after age, each of the Manus re-established Dharma and recommenced Dharma. Beginning with Swayambhuv Manu, through all the middling Manus, right up to Vaivaswat Manu, to whom Vishnu himself descends and gives instruction on how to preserve civilization through the latest flood, after which Manu's boat goes and lands at modern Ayodhya, and then from him actually the modern Indian dynasties originate. Devtas, Rishis, all of them are associated with the Manus. And then there is what is actually modern history really cares about, which is Vanshanucharit. It's a history of dynasties and kings. So this is where we'll hear about Rajas. There are 16 Chakravartins that are mentioned in ancient Indian history, starting with Prithu Venya and then 15 more names. The avatars, their comings and goings, their deeds, their activities. And there are all dharma-centric stories on governance, ethics, sacrifice, truth, virtue, vice. That is all which comes in this section. So even the most quote-unquote historical part of the Purans still underlines itself with dharma-centric stories on human ways of living, human ways of flourishing. So this is the Indian sense of history. This is the Indian sense of timekeeping. And so before we just close, we can now take a very broad look at what would be the makings of an Indian chronological framework. Mind you, I am not talking about Indian chronology. There is no Indian chronology. At best, we should aspire to have a chronological framework, which means a way for us to make sense of all these Indian stories of the past in a modern context. Because only then will we be able to learn from them and we can use them to inform our own flourishing in the future. So when we look at, of course, the Puranic ordering, there is a concept of dating of the Mauryas and the Nandas. Why the Mauryas and the Nandas? Because they are when history actually first dawns in India. Because from there we start finding coins, inscriptions, epigraphies, etc. So there are some relative certainties in the datings of the Mauryas and the Nandas. And the Purans tell us ki, okay, how many generations and dynasties preceded them up to the Mahabharata era. So theoretically, once you are able to set a date for the Mauryas and Nandas, you can actually work backwards to arrive at some date of the Mahabharata. I am not giving you the dates, I mean there can be many dates and I don't want to stake any claims there. But there is a way to do it and there is a chronological framework that can be arrived. But that is not the end of it. Once you do this, if you look at the Manvantara ordering of things in the Purans, then the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, all of these have happened in the 7th and the current Manvantar. And in the 7th and current Manvantar, there are lots of other things. There's a lots of different genealogies. There's a Ramayana era, there's the Vedic era. There are archaeological points that we can start to understand about the Sindhu Saraswati civilization as it's now called compared to the Indus Valley civilization. Linguistic reconciliations to be made with what we know from linguistics and genetics, etc. All of that is in the 7th Manvantar. Then you can go further back, you will have to date the 6th Manvantar. There are stories set in the 6th Manvantar. Prithu Venya, who was the Adi Raja, the first Chakravartin. The advent of agriculture is talked about in the Purans. The Samudra Manthan story, which is one of the last and latter battles between Daityas and Adityas, that is mentioned. All of those are happening in the 6th Manvantar. Wo bhi khatam kar lo, we will have to go even further back. Yeah, dating of all the previous Manvantars right up to the first Manvantar, which of course begins with Brahma himself, the advent of consciousness, the Swayambhu. So that itself will have to be accounted for, and you cannot do this without an overall Yug and Manvantar fitment. So everyone will have to bring up some Yug and Manvantar fitment to do all of this. But even if we do all of this and finish here, we have not touched Itihas. We have only touched history. But when we have understood what Itihas truly means, you have to add to this the evolution of ideas in the Indian context. There must have been a time when there would have been a first Indian who just took a piece of rock and considered it reverential. But there must have been a time then when a deity itself descended into that piece of rock such that now it has become a murti. So Murti Puja itself, there is an advent of it, there is a trajectory to it. India's engagement with the sacred, with the divine, that is the stuff of actual Itihas, and that is what would tell us what K.M. Munshi had talked about, how Indians themselves organized into a collective will. So you will have to talk about the evolution of ideas, Murti Puja, Mantra, Drishti, Agni, Yagna and Havan, these concepts which are core concepts to the Indian civilization, Dev, Devta, Bhagwan. You've done that, you will have to then get into civilizational materia, the wheel, pottery, agriculture, animal husbandry, metallurgy, trade, architecture, so many things to get into that. Wo bhi ho jaye, you will have to talk about the emergence of identity itself, Rashtra, Rajya, Niti. When did these things come about? Who were the ones who informed these thoughts? When Chanakya writes the Arthashastra, He talks about his political predecessors. He begins with Shukracharya and Brihaspati as the originators of political thought. And Shukracharya and Brihaspati were actually tutors to Devtas and Asuras. So that's how far back that lineage goes. And Shukracharya himself is actually descended from Rishi Bhrigu, a Maharishi. Brihaspati is descended from Angiras. They are all self-born sons of Brahma himself. And before them is Brahma, the Swayambhu. Before Brahma you will go to Vishnu. When does it start? It is Sanatan. That is where that sense comes from. And you will have to get into Raja, Samrat, Chakravartin. And as you have done all of this, you will still have to keep a check that actually have you talked about human flourishing and organic will. So this to me is a roadmap, the makings of a chronological framework. And many of us, when we start doing it, you will find koi aur date, koi aur date, koi aur date. But actually when you place all of this anywhere, what will become important is that side of it. It doesn't matter what dates you put on it. What will matter is how through all of that, we will be able to understand and identify what Sri K.M. Munshi had talked about. That the central purpose of a history must be to investigate and unfold the values which age after age have inspired the inhabitants of a country to develop a collective will. And he had said that such a history of India is still to be written, but I would hope that I have convinced you today that actually that history of India is available to us, and we can in fact understand it, identify it and engage with it to inform ourselves, to enrich ourselves. Thank you.